Is it open?
Came across this Southwood Hull.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, I've never used it.
That's good.
And
Do it with
it's a
you.
raised some church lives in Cotting and said
That's good. Yeah.
yeah, it's easy. Yeah. There's some bourbon.
Well, she could never do it till...
Yeah, the South. Yeah. I know, this is
Well, no, I've got quite a lot of people who owe me quite a bit who are actually actors. But I'd much rather have you. May I come and sniff next to you?
Yeah, sure. Can you see there with that?
Oh, yes.
Just be careful with this, because that's balancing on there quite
Right.
precariously.
Yeah. Sorry, you were about to say
So
something.
you showed us 3 or 4 paintings.
Yeah.
Basically, they were storyboarding
Yeah.
the journey, weren't they?
Yeah.
But actually, when I thought about it later, the journey didn't start with the stable going off to Egypt. It started well before then with the journey to this
Not in Matthew. This is the thing. There are 2 completely separate narratives of the Nativity. And apart from the fact that there was a child born called Jesus, and the parents were called Mary and Joseph,
Did you go into Minster?
and it was in Bethlehem, they have no connection at all. Because the Luke...
Except they do. The Bible's telling us to stick.
Well,
You know, as a Christian.
Well, as a
story.
Christian, yes, as a Christian, the whole thing gets conflated.
Yeah.
But Luke has an annunciation, it has the birth of John the Baptist, it has the shepherds.
You've got a full minute still. All right.
Matthew, they're already living in Bethlehem, there's no journey to Bethlehem, there are no shepherds, there's no annunciation. The angel comes to Joseph and tells him about it. In Matthew, you get the Magi, the massacre of the innocents and the flight into Egypt, and the return to Bethlehem, after which, having discovered that Herod's successor is no better than Herod, they move to Nazareth.
Yeah. I mean, I take all that you're saying about Matthew, but as I say, I look at it as a
Of
whole.
course you do, because the whole, and this is part of the point that I didn't get over, which I was really trying to, is that what we've got as the nativity story has
Good
had a
afternoon,
steady growth.
everyone. Is the volume all right for the people sort of in the back, or can I be quieter, louder? We're all good. Perfect. Hello, everyone. Welcome away from the heat and into Hull Minster today for our next bi-weekly Heritage Talk series as part of our 600th anniversary celebrations of the Minster this year. And for those of you who have been with us before, a warm welcome back to Hull Minster. My name's James. I'm the Heritage Project Manager here at Hull Minster, and I'm delighted to be able to present you this Heritage Talk. These Heritage Talks are part of a series that we're bringing back for our 600th anniversary this year, every other Friday at lunchtime here in the chancel of Hull Minster, with some really fantastic guest speakers from local tour guides, academics, or just local people with a real passion for history who want to get it out there. We used to run these talks semi-regularly, and we're delighted we're being able to make a habit of running them again. Typically, I preface the talk with a little anecdote about the speaker and why I'm so excited for the subject that they're presenting, but I'm afraid on this occasion it would make me look very self-indulgent. That's because this is the one day of the year where you all have to listen to me a lot longer than you usually do. I don't want to be the kind of heritage manager that tells everyone else to contribute to these talks and not do something myself. So alas, now you have me. For the sake of putting credentials out there, I am the Heritage Manager at Hull Minster at the minute. I studied history at the University of Victoria, West Coast Canada, very, very far away. And I finished my studies at University of Leeds and University of York, doing a subject called Public History, which we'll talk about a bit more in detail as part of this presentation. I do have half a mind to sort of leave the stage and run back on, because usually I hand over to the speaker and there's a big round of applause and then they kind of start doing their thing. Thank you. I shamelessly put into the script, please applaud for me, so I'm glad that you took it out of my hands. That's done wonder for my self-confidence. Thank you. So, you can't trust history. This is me. Striking resemblance. I'm interviewing to get a job here as the Heritage Manager at Hull Minster. That's Dominic, the vicar. He's explaining to me what my job's going to be, what the significance of it is, and especially explaining to me that this is the 600th year of Holy Trinity Church, as it was once known, the 600th anniversary of the consecration of the church, no less, and that's a very big deal for the Minster. As it happens, I'm not terrible at interviews, and now I stand before you as the Heritage Manager here. But as is the case with bureaucracy here, I've found everything takes a little longer than you would want it to take. So I had to wait a couple of weeks before I could officially start. And in that time, the vicar, Dominic, sent me a message on Microsoft Teams. The message reads, "Fake history. This is the translation by Professor Barbara English of the document from the Borthwick. Apparently, 1425 was not the consecration of the high altar at all." Sure enough, that was quickly followed up by an email from said professor, where she said the following. 1425 concerns the reconciliation or reconsecration of a restored altar in the Lady Chapel and has nothing to do with the high altar or any other part of the church. Your famous church, with its famous early bricks, has of course a much longer history than 600 years, with the probable date of 1285, vicars from 1326, and a graveyard consecrated in 1301. Of course, the church was active all those decades, and the Black Death nearly 100 years earlier has nothing at all to do with the reconsecration. To add to this, as you will know, the English calendar year started on the 25th of March until the change in 1756. So when this is taken into account, 2025 is only 599 years since the Lady Altar was consecrated, or reconsecrated. As someone who was hired specifically to celebrate the 600th anniversary, you can probably imagine that's quite a bombshell to receive before you've even started. But as I spoke to people around the church, some who have volunteered here for longer than I've been alive, I quickly realized something. 1425 has been celebrated as the consecration year many times before. We held our 500th anniversary 100 years ago in 1925, and its 550th 50 years ago, 1975. But just when I thought we'd agreed on the century, 1985 rolls around, and this gets published. Can you see it? Holy Trinity Parish Church has stood in the marketplace in Hull for 700 years. Apparently time travel was invented in Hull. And now, of course, we've gone backwards again, and we're celebrating our 600th anniversary. So what gives? Why can nobody seem to make up their mind about the foundation of Hull Minster? How did we get it so wrong? And how can this iteration of what Dominic calls false history inform us of likewise issues when discussing the past? What other instances of history have maybe been lost, perverted, modified, not agreed upon? And why has that been the case? This talk hopes to do a case study on 3 of such instances, all of which will offer their own insights as to how history can change over time, how context, both contemporary and present-day context, can affect historical narrative, and why this happens. The 3 topics covered today are going to be hugely different. First, talking about the earliest secular biographies of Western European kings, to challenge why any of that medieval wash is worth bothering with. I'll be discussing how the narrative of the First World War was allegedly hijacked by a combination of the war poets and very unfortunate hindsight, allegedly. And then finally, we'll come full circle back to Holy Trinity Hull and assess the debate as to when this church properly started, and I will give my verdict on it, unbiasedly, of course. Before we go into the meat of this talk, I want to make clear this is less so a talk about factual history, but instead a subsection of history, the one that I studied in York, known as public history. If you're asking yourself what public history is, don't bother, because we spent 2 seminars trying to figure that out and ended up with more questions than answers. But what I suppose it means is the study of the way that the public digests history. How do they do it? So through what mediums? Why do they do it? Are they innately fascinated by it, or are they trying to prove a point through it? And what do they get out of it? The big buzzword that gets thrown around in public history a lot, and I've already said it plenty of times so far, is that word narrative. Because that goes some way in answering all 3 of those questions. How do they engage in history? Often through narratives, storytelling, easy to put together sequences of events. Why do they do it? Perhaps to flesh out a narrative they already understand. And what do they glean from it? Oftentimes the morals and lessons that these narratives provide, like any story or fairy tale. You can't spell history without story after all. Narratives are easy to follow, and they streamline history, especially for people who might not be so historically inclined. But that comes with its issues. Turning history into a narrative does streamline history. It simplifies it. It removes important contexts and gray areas that can make history oftentimes misleading. See, narratives are easiest to follow when they're black and white. The Black Death, for instance, obviously very bad, horrible event, and killed millions and millions of people in Europe. Ask anybody, and 95% of people will say one of the worst things ever to happen to medieval Europe. But that gray area does exist. That gray area that says the resulting labor shortage caused by the Black Death meant laborers and serfs could negotiate better terms for themselves, offering a generational opportunity for social mobility in a medieval period where that social mobility oftentimes didn't exist. There's a silver lining to everything. Now that's very cool, but that makes the Black Death far less digestible, especially to someone whom history is not their main interest, which is sadly a lot of us. Now, instead of talking about how many people have died, we're talking about subjects like serfdom, medieval hierarchy, social structure, etc., which might be too much for someone with only a passing interest in history. As so, casual narratives of the Black Death are often omitted. People are more interested in why it was so deadly. The symptoms, how many people died, themes that perhaps don't require a great deal of context to understand. In essence, people want this. They want the Monty Python version of the Black Death. Perhaps to show how far we've come as a society. I'm not so sure. Omitting information from a narrative is one thing, but falsifying it is something else entirely. But I'll give you a quick example. Once upon a time, I went to Canterbury. I visited a museum in the Westgate Towers, which is a brilliant museum, and if you've not been, I highly recommend you visit. Before it was a museum, it was used as a county jail. And in the museum, they tell a story of this strange, really brutal-looking wooden box. Now, the real function of this box was to punish petty criminals for reasons such as fighting, swearing, intoxication, insubordination, and otherwise attending the pub. Those kept here would remain there for about 2 or 3 nights before being let out. So in essence, it's a timeout corner for large children. After those 2 or 3 nights, that person would be let out, and that would be the end of it. But when the museum opened in 1906, the curator for the museum was not happy about having this great, big, scary wooden box and a really underwhelming story attached to it. So he went around and sold it as something else entirely. He named it the condemnation cell. And in the earliest guidebooks of the museum, it was described as, and I'm quoting here, the place where wretches sentenced to death spent their final hour before being let out to the gallows. Which, let's be honest, sounds more exciting than mildly drunk man sobers up in a wooden cupboard. To us historians, this is blasphemous and intentional misinformation, but likewise, I think we can all understand the appeal of the condemnation cell. Bear those instances of public history and of narrative in mind as we go through the 3 main examples of narrative that I'll be covering, starting with this one. Let's talk about this guy. This is Charles the Great, Charlemagne to his mates. If you're not too familiar with him, I'll give you a quick 1-minute rundown. He was the first ever Holy Roman Emperor, and his coronation in 800 by the hands of Pope Leo III, the first time a Western European monarch of his stature was crowned by the Pope, set a precedent that would come to define the Middle Ages, that being the relationship between the Church in Rome and the feudal state. At its height, his empire would cover most of Western Europe, and these were not easy conquests either. Germany, especially, pagan at the time, and Charles's conquest into Central Europe brought Christianity with it. His burning of the sacred tree Irminsul considered a flashpoint for the decline of paganism in Europe. He had his own Renaissance. He invented his own script, in fact, and the borders drawn after his death, when the land was redistributed amongst his sons, which you can see here, would come to define the rough outlines of France, Germany, and the bit that France and Germany would spend the next 1,000 years fighting over. Needless to say, he was a hugely influential figure for the Middle Ages. Now, we know quite a lot about Charlemagne, which is actually a bit unusual, because up until Charlemagne, we know very, very little about Western European monarchs, their lives, and their accomplishments. There do exist some histories from this period, but many of these histories are people's histories instead of the histories of an individual. These kind of came after the Romans' anthropological histories of the barbarians of the north and were written in a very similar way. There did exist some Roman biographies as well, but talking in this religious sense, as we'll discover, this kind of new form of biography would take a different form altogether. Regardless of the fact that these secular biographies did not exist so much in the Frankish kingdoms, work began on a biography for the Frankish King Charles. The resulting book from the monk and writer Einhard is titled The Life of Charles, or Vitas Carolus, which is, in no exaggeration, one of the most important and influential historical texts ever written in the Western world. Not just because of its content, and there is a lot of it, but because the style in which it was written would influence so many histories and biographies afterwards. As historian Jason Glenn wrote in his work on the life of Charles, no one in the lands of the Western Roman Empire or the Frankish kingdoms that emerged in their place, or anywhere else in Europe, thought to write the biography of a ruler. As such, Einhard had to pioneer a new form of writing almost, as the first person who would have done this since Roman times that he'd have known of. Ultimately, he did a reasonably good job, or we wouldn't be talking about him today. But as one of the few primary source documents from this time, it's come under intense scrutiny from historians, and the cracks have begun to show in its validity. Let's discuss one of the obvious biases first. It turns out Einhard had quite a unique relationship with Charlemagne himself. The motive for Einhard writing this piece is ultimately unknown. We don't know if Charlemagne commissioned him to do it. We don't know if one of his children commissioned him to do it. We don't know if Einhard did it out of the good of his own heart. If we are to believe the man himself, Einhard, though, it would seem to be the latter of those three. In his preface, he states he owes a great deal to the Frankish king, calling Charlemagne his foster father, and stating that he would, quote, rightly seem to be judged ungrateful if I forgot the many kindnesses he bestowed upon me. Now, we don't know any of Einhard's and Charlemagne's relationship outside this book, but if he is to be believed, that's quite worrying that we have such a major primary source that is being written less as a history and more as an ode to a close friend. That alone should be enough to cast doubt to this as a reliable historical source. Well, of the studies made into the life of Charles, the discussion seems to not center around what is included in the life of Charles, but rather what is not present. Oftentimes he describes, for instance, Charles's great victories and accomplishments in war, but he never records the reasons why these wars were fought in the first place. Perhaps trying to mask the fact that Charlemagne was a bit of a warmonger, which he would need to be to own that much land and keep it. He also describes a family drama where Charles's brother, King Carloman, suddenly dies under what has been always termed as mysterious circumstances. And he refuses to elaborate onto the reasons as to why Carloman's family flees to Italy instead to with his brother's court in France. Conveniently, Carloman's land upon his death is annexed into Charlemagne's own kingdom, so it doesn't take a bloodhound to smell something fishy going on there. Einhard chooses not to elaborate on this subject. It feels like information is being withheld from us. Which is a bit unusual because there is so much information in this account. It's clear that Einhard is trying to write with as much detail as he possibly can, or why else would he mention the fates of Carloman's family at all? But in spite of this, it bears remembering that this is being written as that ode to a friend instead of a history. It's made even more egregious when we consider what Einhard's literary inspirations would have been. As we've established, he's writing a very unique piece of work, a secular biography. It's unrealistic to assume he would have not taken influences from something, knowingly or not. Now, while secular biographies weren't mainstream at this time, there did exist very popular biographies that someone in the church, someone like Einhard, would have been very familiar with, if anyone can posit a guess as to what those biographies would have been. Saints' lives, oftentimes, the motivation for this. And when we consider what the motivations for writing a saint's life would be, that being to capture and inform the reader of an ideal person, someone to emulate, someone worthy of sainthood, in fact, and compare that to Einhard's own motives, we can see another reason why he might omit the not-so-great parts of Charlemagne's life. Turns out he did a really good job of writing Charlemagne as a saint because he was a venerated saint who was canonized by a pope. That pope being an anti-pope set up by a future Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick Barbarossa. He's still worshipped in his court in Aachen today, with reliquaries containing different parts of him, including this bust containing part of his skull that when I had the chance to visit Aachen, we saw someone prostrating and praying in front of. As I mentioned earlier, the propelling of Christendom into Central Europe makes him a hugely important religious figure. But whether he lived a saintly life, as Einhard claims, is entirely in question. If all that's not enough, there are actual factual inaccuracies in Einhard's history as well. He begins his biography with a brief summary of the original Frankish dynasty, the Merovingians. Now, the last Merovingian king, pictured here, a man called Childeric III, was, according to Einhard, a man with very little political or economic power, a weak king. Eventually, a powerful noble by the name of Pepin the Short wrote to the Pope, Stephen II, to argue that the title should become, argued that the royal title should come by might instead of by right. Stephen II agreed and sanctioned the deposition of Childeric. Pepin would then go on to father Charlemagne. That sounds plausible enough, and most of the information is correct, except that it was not Pope Stephen II at all who did it, and in fact, Pope Zacharias the Greek, a really obvious thing to mess up in something that you'd consider a history. Einhard's own account clashes with other histories. The Royal Frankish Annals, one of those people's histories that I mentioned earlier, and Einhard's Life of Charles both recount the Battle of Roncevaux Pass. The annals tell of the whole army being engaged, and a massacre with most of Charlemagne's commanders killed. But Einhard insists it's only the rear baggage train that was caught in the fray. Who's more likely to be right? It turns out it's probably the annals. See, Einhard was writing this piece with more than a little bit of hindsight. The Life of Charles was completed in the year 830, 16 years after Charlemagne's death in 814. Now, time can distort memory quite a bit, but Einhard, being the scholar he was, would have had notes, surely. Well, he may have had some, but he almost certainly didn't have them all. Einhard wrote his own work in relative seclusion in a town called, and I hope I'm not butchering this, Seligenstadt, almost 200 miles away from the royal court in Aachen, which is roughly where the Arrow is, just west of Dusseldorf. If he didn't keep a record detailing the deposition of the Merovingian kings, how can we not know he's writing other parts of this by memory? Would that not incline Einhard to perhaps lean on his bias even more? And with that, we come to the issue regarding Charlemagne. Very little primary history is written of him, save for Einhard's account. This big, monstrous source, chock full of information, and seemingly a gold mine for this period, one of the few existing sources, but written by a biased monk writing at least parts of it from memory. Despite that, somehow, Einhard's image of Charlemagne remains, this saintly king wielding the cross and the sword, a great educator, caregiver to his family, fashionable, powerful, and a model king. The public historian in me asks why, when he could well have killed his own brother to seize his land, when he invaded Germany and desecrated willfully these sacred pagan spaces. Why are we holding this image of Charlemagne in such high regard? And the answer is simply the narrative that followed. Firstly, and this is me speculating, that this is exactly the image Einhard wanted. Charlemagne was the first of his kind, a great medieval king. And Einhard knew he'd be producing a work that would have been read and reproduced everywhere, to many royal courts. He may have been doing a favor to his friend by writing of him so highly, but he might have also been setting out his own definition of what made a great medieval king, using Charlemagne as a vessel rather than his 100% likeness. And why wouldn't have he done that? Because Charlemagne did so much to empower the church on his own. If Einhard's writings could influence more scholarly, pious, and powerful kings, that could be a legacy Einhard himself, as the author, would be proud of. As it would happen, it would be a skill set that would define many of Europe's best monarchs for the next 1,000 years. Secondly, Charlemagne, in that period of French history, was captured in another hugely impactful medieval source, those being the Chanson de Geste, and particularly the Song of Roland. These are 11th and 12th century written French poems that came to emblemize medieval themes like chivalry, gallantness, courtly love, and are the songs that you would see sung by medieval troubadours as the French court became more powerful over the medieval period. The chansons are quite unique because they weren't just a royal culture, they became a pop culture as well. They were sung in town squares to largely illiterate audiences. And for something to transcend that gap between the higher and lower classes was something quite unusual at that time. So it would have taken a massive cultural or tonal shift to shift that narrative away from Charlemagne being such a great ruler. And lastly is that he was actually that great, and as such politically very important, even after his death. So much so that he was attempted to be canonized by Frederick Barbarossa to try to sanctify his own position as the Holy Roman Emperor. He was, after all, the founding father for the Kingdom of France and the Holy Roman Empire, Western Europe's two biggest powerhouses in the Middle Ages. So for the crowns on both sides to promote this positive narrative of Charlemagne makes sense. His power influences royal power. That theory lines up because the first instances where we begin to see written criticism of Charlemagne is when the power of royalty becomes into question in France. And the big motivator behind that would end up being Voltaire. Voltaire, whose legacy would come to influence the monarch-toppling French Revolution. Charlemagne would be vilified in France for some time until the return of royalty through Napoleon brought him back. And Charlemagne became a symbol of Napoleon's conquest into Germany. Once that happened, another narrative took over. Charlemagne as a symbol of French imperialism. And the Germans attempted to disown Charlemagne entirely, terming him a Saxon slayer who had basically destroyed their native religion some 1,000 years ago, going against the 1,000 years narrative of treating him as a saintly figure. That view persisted in Germany until guess who brought him back from the dead? Good old Hitler. He rebranded Charlemagne from the Saxon butcher that he was before to the unifier of Europe through the great Nazi propaganda machine. Again, if the narrative fits, then we can see history being completely rethought, recontextualized, reused, and reemployed as needs be. And to see that recent history has seen Charlemagne reinterpreted so many times, by not just a class of people, but by a people as a whole, is very interesting. Narrative is not something that constricts exclusively old history with few sources. There is more recent history that falls subject to some similar shortcomings. I want to share one of my favorite poems ever with you here to show my point, and I'll try to talk through this part a little slower than usual so as to give you some time to read it if you haven't had the privilege of doing so already. This poem, Dulce et Decorum Est, written by Wilfred Owen, is amongst a myriad of poems written after the First World War, decrying the horrors of the war, the gas, no man's land, the squalor, and doing a very good job of encapsulating the themes that these poems would rally around, ultimately killing the idea of the romantic image of war along with it. The final verse of the poem, if your Latin isn't up to scratch, Dulce et decorum est pro patria mori, translates to, it is sweet and proper to die for one's country. I think when many of us think of the First World War, we think of the image that Owen describes in this poem, and it's for very good reason. War has never been quite the same since. The First World War is considered one of the most tragic, and I think it's been considered quite cynically one of the most pointless wars in history. Pointless in the sense that it was meant to be this war to end all wars, but instead the treaties and relationships it bore led to a much more devastating Second World War, leading many to believe that the people who had died in the First World War had maybe done so in vain. I can understand that narrative with the benefit of hindsight, but that is the narrative as it exists now. It's not always been that way. And especially in the immediate aftermath of the war, the perspective ended up being a bit different. Today, the Great War is commemorated very highly through Remembrance Day, the laying of wreaths, war memorials and cenotaphs in every town and city. But in the immediate aftermath of the war, the general public did not want this. They were largely against the idea of commemorating the war through monuments, ceremonies, obelisks. And chief among these reasons was the belief that the money should be spent much more practically. The belief that it should be spent on houses and hospitals for the soldiers coming back from the war. Those soldiers, rightly held as heroes, spending some of them almost 5 years in the front lines of service, probably would have expected as much on their way home. And it's for that reason that Prime Minister David Lloyd George campaigned under the promise of homes fit for heroes, and in the post-war general election in 1918 won such a convincing landslide after the war under a conservative liberal coalition. Conservative liberal coalition, what a time to be alive. Practical solutions to the problem at hand were placed well above the priority list compared to the themes of reflection that we hold of the war now. Now that's a short-term and probably inevitable narrative shift that will happen after wars. The Second World War held a similar narrative, with the extensive rebuilding of the country under Clement Attlee placed before the themes of remembrance, and that's why he was able to knock Churchill out of office in the subsequent election. There are a few more reasons why the British didn't view the Great War so solemnly in its immediate aftermath. Some of them, especially the British working class, had seen major day-to-day improvements due to the circumstances the war brought. The fact was, that by the end of the war, Britain had this kind of paradox of a population. People who needed real help after being scarred by the war, but also people who had financially never been better off than they were. The Great War did a great deal, actually, to bridge the gap between the working class and the middle class of Britain for a number of reasons. And one of their greatest victories was the positive development of the housing situation for the people in Britain. Social upheavals and protests during the First World War led to an influx of revolutionary new rent controls, the first of their kind, that limited the powers of predatory landlords. During the war, requests were made of rurally based people to relocate to these large urban areas to help the wartime economy. So your Birminghams, your Manchesters, especially Glasgow in this period. These cities saw influxes of population that were tied down by their employment. Clever landlords realized this and took the approach of milking the new workers for all that they were worth. This led to housing riots during the war that culminated in the War Restrictions Act of 1915, which effectively froze rents to their 1914 levels for the rest of the war. Although designed to be temporary, some of these buildings would actually continue to be affected by this act all the way until 1989, quite some time afterwards. More importantly, though, and this is huge and worth stating, it set the precedent that the people could affect the housing market. It's among the first instances in British history where we see the masses confront the landlords and landowners and win and take something positive out of it. This is again another reason why Lloyd George's Homes for Heroes ended up being so popular. They saw another unexpected win during the war, and that was actually better provisions by the war's end. Paradoxically, the cause for that was rationing. The beginning of the war was very hard on the working class, like any war would be. The slow import of supplies began to strain prices. A poor harvest in 1916 and the beginning of the German U-boat offensive precipitated the need for rationing midway through the war. First with coal in late 1916, and then food in early 1917. Rationing in the Great War went altogether pretty well. It solved the issue of food prices and food queuing in the UK. But it had the unintended knock-on effect of actually treating Britain's poorest people to much more balanced diets than they would have otherwise had. The poor working class people in the run-up to the First World War were still living under Edwardian conditions, very cramped spaces, a very bare-bones diet, and quite vulnerable to disease, the main one being pneumonia in the winter months. That was a killer. Coal and food rationing brought onto these people luxuries that might not have been afforded to them before. Meat, primarily, which many of these families might not usually afford, became a ration-enforced staple. Coal, which many of these people couldn't regularly afford, was now mandated. As a whole, this led to the poorest people in the country eating more balanced diets, and it turned the threat of wintertime pneumonia to the working class into a non-issue for a while. And we don't see the effects of this healthy lower class so much during wartime, but rationing in the UK continued until 1920. And if you look at some health-related graphs upon the war's end, you can see not just a rebound after the war, which is what we would expect, but in a lot of cases, an absolute skyrocketing. Now, I'd love to be able to show you things like life expectancy and mortality rates to back that point up, but as many as you know, the Spanish flu came shortly after the First World War and had quite a large effect on the health data at the time. But as it would happen, we do have an example we can use here. An example unaffected by the Spanish flu is infant mortality and live birth rates. As it would happen, the First World War was a really good time to be a baby or to be an infant. Here's a graph demonstrating the infant mortality rate in these big working cities in the First World War. You can see they're dropping a fair bit between 1900 and 1910, and then a more sort of plateaued decline in the next 10 years, even during the war. That graph there, this shaded bit, is showing the wartime years. Even the wartime numbers seem to be following a fairly consistent trend. But as soon as the war is over, we see a steep decline in infant mortality. particularly between 1919 and 1923. A similar graph depicting London city centre and England and Wales more broadly sees the same conclusion. After the war, the drop in infant mortality is sharp and very, very strong. And this comes down to the health of the people. It's a direct correlation. This data from these graphs was accumulated by a trio of writers and analysts, John Winter, John Lawrence, and Jackie Arouillat. And they concluded that the war had contradictory effects on the birth rate, and when peace had been brought, leaving only the good bits, that's why we see this steep change upon the war's end. If we believe the West Sussex County Council's assessment, which was on the slides a few slides earlier, we can posit that the stronger, healthier diets contributed to this, as well as the improved housing conditions. On the contrary, being an upper-class person in the First World War would have been absolutely dreadful. Whereas the rationing might have had a positive effect on the lower class, it had an inverse effect on the higher classes. The fact the amount of rationed coal that you were allocated scaled depending on the amount of rooms in your house did not treat upper-class people very well at all. Beyond that, on the battlefield, upper-class people were killed disproportionately more than lower-class people, because these people, your Cambridge, Oxford, and Eton graduates, were oftentimes the officers, i.e. the first people over the trench in those suicidal charges across no man's land. It's for that reason we talk about the lost generation in the interwar periods. For these reasons, you can understand why some pragmatic working-class folk might come to romanticize the Great War rather than loathe it. If you haven't read Robbie Roberts' book, great name by the way, The Classic Slum, I highly recommend that you read through some of it. He gives a working-class account from Salford of the changes that the First World War had brought to him and his community. And in that book, he titles the First World War as The Great Release of the Working Class. And when you read his arguments and reasoning, some of which have been covered in this talk, you can see why. The living conditions for the working class after the First World War were better than they had been before. And were it not for the hindsight offered by the Second World War, we might be seeing this as perhaps a great equalizer and a great impact towards a positive social change in Britain. So now we end up back here, trying to answer why we celebrate so many different anniversary years at Holy Trinity, why there seems to be so much confusion as to whether or not it was consecrated in 1425 and what all of that means. I'm glad you're at this talk and in this building and hearing this from myself, because I'm afraid if you were to look at the answer online, you will end up even more confused. The story, as we know and as we tell at the Minster, is that the construction of the Minster began in 1285. It made quick progress before coming to a screeching halt because of the Black Death, and then it was finally completed by 1425, although the tower was completed in the 1500s. If you look online, though, you'll find all sorts of claims, some from pretty reputable sources. Historic England claims that the construction began in 1300, 15 years after we think so. Worse yet, and so egregious it's funny, are three entries from visitoruk.com, the ever-reliable Wikipedia, and parishmouse.co.uk, a site that tracks family histories through parish records. All of these entries claim that Holy Trinity began construction in 1285, so that lines up pretty well, but that it was completed by 1312. So what's gone on there? The good news about Wikipedia, at least, is that they need to footnote everything. So I followed the rabbit hole down to this excerpt from the Edinburgh Encyclopedia, written in 1830, where the writer, David Brewster, claims that Holy Trinity was only partly built in 1312. He does not give a fixed start or end date of the church, and he's intentionally vague so that people don't misquote or misrepresent him. Unfortunately, it doesn't seem to have worked. 7 years before that, so we're in 1823 now, a similar text from this period, titled, and this is a long one, Baines' History, Directory and Gazetteer of the County of York, version 2, East and North Writings, 1823, written by Edward Baines, writes the following. In 1328, John Rotenherring, one of Hull's merchant princes, founded a charity in Holy Trinity Church, which is said to have been founded in 1285. That lines up pretty nicely. But the next line of this text says, By some historians, it has been asserted that the present church was not commenced until 1312. So that doesn't make any sense. According to Baines, some people did not think the church had even begun until 1312. I can't find any sources that back up Baines's claim, but I don't think he would have written this if he wasn't trying to make a point, if he wasn't trying to disprove something that he had read or otherwise heard elsewhere. Another 7 years earlier, John Cragg's Guide to Hull says the following on the church. Quote, "What we know for certain about the first foundation of the Church of Holy Trinity is that the building of the east part of it, now the chancel and the steeple, was considerably advanced but not finished in the 6th year of the reign of King Edward II, 1312. So this year, 1312, it doesn't seem to make any sense. If we're to believe Baines, then some historians think that this was the start date for the building of the church. Then by one account, it's partly built, and in another account, it's been significantly advanced and not finished. There's a great deal of confusion and a big lack of specificity surrounding this year. Yet somehow, some modern scholars claim that this is actually the finishing and final year of construction of the church. 1312 is somehow the start year, a year of significant advancement, a dead rubber of a year, and the completion year all in one. So what's happened? Ultimately, it's just lazy historianship, which is a shame. And perhaps we should take this at face value, the same way that Edward Baines, who wrote one of those earlier histories, admitted. He said in this same piece of writing, quote, "With regards to the history of this church, there is very little known as to how it has grown to its present imposing and noble appearance. So maybe there is no way to know for sure. But one date that does not come up in any of these texts," and there's a picture that didn't load, which is funny, "is the year 1425. In so many online sources and websites, we hear that it's the consecration date of the church. But we saw in the introduction from Professor Barbara English that that is just not true. What we do know, however, is that the nave of the church was completed by 1425, meaning that, bar the large tower, this became a functional, no more work innately needed building in its entirety by that year. As I mentioned, we have a rich tradition of celebrating 1425. We had our 500th anniversary. We had our 550th, complete with festival services, which we still have. We have a rich tradition of celebrating 1425, which is, in my view, worth preserving. Has the year 1425 lost some of its shine now that we know that it's not the consecration year of the church anymore? Perhaps it has a little bit. But now it's time for me to sow a narrative that can hopefully get you believing that this date is still worth celebrating. This is the stunning Cologne Cathedral. It is one of the most beautiful and awe-inspiring churches in Europe. The tallest twin-spired church in the world, in fact. And it is absolutely huge. And I would know because I climbed to the top of the tower. And it ruined the rest of the holiday. It has a founding myth that's actually not that dissimilar to Holy Trinity's. It began construction in 1258, so about 30 years or so off of our building. Like Minster and many churches across Europe, its construction screeched to a halt with the coming and going of the Black Death. But here's where the stories differ. Minster dusted itself off. It took time, but eventually they got the work of the church done. Towerless, but done, in 1425. Cologne Cathedral, on the other hand, never quite recovered. The workforce came back very slowly, the motivation wasn't there, and most importantly, the money dried up entirely. Cologne as a town fell onto very hard times, and there were no local people, no wealthy local people, who could have sponsored the completion of the church. Some work was done in the 1400s, but quickly it was apparent that this work would never get finished. And so, Cologne Cathedral stood, with this big medieval crane hovering over the city skyline like a big rusted question mark over the city, until the 1800s when it was finally picked up again. The wave of 19th century Romanticism and the city's rediscovered wealth from the Industrial Revolution finally got the cathedral completed by 1880. 632 years after it had begun. And if you know your history, you know that only 60 years after that, the Second World War broke out, and Cologne was amongst the most devastated cities in the entire world in the war. Cologne Cathedral itself was hit 14 times by Allied bombs, so obvious extensive repairs were needed after. So even the original church lived a very charmed and short and cherished life. When you consider that story, and you consider what could have been, then I think Holy Trinity's completion by 1425 is actually something quite spectacular. The fact that Hull had persevered as a city after 60% of its population was wiped out from the plague, maintained enough wealth and status to jumpstart the reconstruction of Holy Trinity afterwards, and to have completed it by 1425, being the largest parish church in England, no less, is in hindsight a stunning achievement, and one that is worth celebrating when one considers the fate of similar churches across Britain and Europe. It's a testament to the city and its inhabitants, and it's for that reason we like to say in the Minster that the Minster's history is Hull's history, and vice versa. A history of perseverance through hard times, through the plague, through wars, through financial hardships. And yet, like it always has been since 1425, Holy Trinity Church still stands here, a living reflection of an extraordinary city and an extraordinary people who have carried it through centuries of chaos, confusion, and commemorations. Thank you. I can take some questions or comments now if anyone does want to question or comment. Otherwise, I will get on to my typical closing script.
Can I just say, James?
Yes.
A comment, not a question. Thank you for making the final point that the wealth of Hull has permitted this to continue. I think it's something that's not appreciated by, really, people who don't know Hull. It's very significant. It's really nice that you made that point.
Thank you. Thank you. I'll have to repeat what you said because I've got this microphone and a live screen going on and there's no way that I'll be able to hear you. But the comment was that the point about the wealth of Hull being able to precipitate the building of the church was a very, very impactful as to why the church is the way it is today. And I think that's a really great point. You see so many lay people commemorated and memorialized in the walls here. And if you haven't had the opportunity to look into some of these people, please do, because some of them are so fascinating. We're talking about how difficult social mobility was in the past. And there are some people here, Thomas Ferris is my favorite, because he starts as a seaman, and he grows into this hugely influential figure who's commemorated here in the 1600s, I believe he was alive. So that is not something that happened very often, but it's something that occurred here, and he is kept here as an example of that. So 100% agree with your point. I think it's really worth making a lot of noise about. Yes?
Yeah, couple of comments.
Yeah.
One is that I went to a lecture by a Yale professor in the Merovingian and Frankish kings, and he said that the main thing they have given us is that the names make perfect cat names.
Well, like Schilderic.
Yes, and
right.
yes, I mean, he went a whole list of them. I think he'd named every single cat he'd ever known after one of them. That's one. Two, if Barbara English says it, you can trust it.
Yeah.
She's unlike the vast majority of Hull historians, she doesn't invent things. That's two. And the third one is, if you're looking for some fake history, have a go sometime at the plotting parlour, which is in a building that was built after the Civil War.
In Hull.
Yes.
Right.
I mean, the story of what actually happened in the plotting parlour is great. It was the town-taking day. But I think I'm banned from that pub.
I'll pay a visit at some point, and if I can get myself banned, I'll have that as a badge of honor. Jean.
Possibly I was one of the people who set you off on your search for 1425, partly because John Major had set up this year that we were going to have to celebrate, because he had in front of him the 100-year celebration. And I thought, right, we'll check on that. So I was in touch with the Borthwick. They put on screen the actual wording, but by that time, everything had gone to 1425. Jordan, who wrote his history back in the 1920s, was the one who said 1425 was the anniversary. But it was going back to that original document all the time. Well, that's what historians should do. Look at the actual words before they start expounding and everything else.
Yeah.
But I think we've got over that one now.
Yes.
Yes.
We have now. We fixed the wording
Yeah.
since I've come in. So.
And the Borthwick sample is there. If anybody wants to see a copy, I'll send it off. I've still got it on my screen of this consecration of a chapel that isn't even named.
Thank you. Do look at the Borthwick papers as well, if you can read the poorly illegible handwriting of the document. Okay. Oh, one more. Sorry.
Just an anecdote, James.
Yeah.
At one time, the gate out the south side here had a padlock on with a number on to get into it, and that number was 1285. Across the square, when we used to have the parish offices there, the alarm used to have a number on it, and the number was 1425. Somewhere along the line, somebody had taken those two dates and decided they're vital dates to have as part of our security. If there was a break-in, I'd have looked for a historian.
Here's hoping now that the PIN number for the church's credit card is not also 1285. All right, I'll do my kind of conclusion-y bit now. Thank you for coming to the talk today and for listening to me. As I said in the beginning, we're running these heritage talks bi-weekly now, so the next major talk is on the 25th of July. That's being run by Richard Clark, and he's talking about grave diggers and grave thieving in Hull and East Yorkshire in the 19th century. So if you have that kind of morbid fascination of history, you might find that talk quite entertaining. Before I leave you, I need to do my duty, as I always do, and plug the Minster a little bit. It is lunchtime, and it's quite warm, and you don't want to go outside yet, trust me. So please spend some more time inside in the cafe. And grab yourself some delicious cold drinks. This talk is part of our 600th year celebrations, and it's been supported by the National Heritage Lottery Fund. We had our medieval day about a month or so ago, and our next major heritage event is unfortunately not until September with Heritage Open Days. There'll be tons of crafts for the young ones, the chance to handle some of the Minster's artifacts, and even an opportunity to speak to some of the dead people in the church who will be risen from their graves and roaming the halls of the Minster once more. So do keep your eye out for that. And finally, and I know this is a point that is drilled home quite often, it costs £1,000 a day to keep Hull Minster open. And by attending events like this and donating, you are helping to preserve this church, which we've just talked about being so important, and preserving it for future generations to come. So if you can give a donation, please do. And thank you all for attending.
Just to finish off, so one idea was the storyboarding, your 4 or 5 things were storyboarding. The second thing was you had one of the paintings, can't remember which one, maybe it was the Elbricker one, where you talked about corn.
That was the Caravaggio.
Caravaggio, okay. Immediately I thought,